Hello, everyone. We're coming in for our other mystery surprise topic today. Even though it's a little later than I would usually like, but honestly, it doesn't matter that much to me. People will see it when they see it. But anyway, as I mentioned earlier this week, I was going to have one more surprise topic that I was going to do, and in this instance, as I had mentioned earlier in the week, it was another civil war, but this one took place in the 20th century. Now, I don't know if anyone would have guessed it, but if anyone happened to maybe guess the Civil War in China, then you were correct. I don't know if anyone would have guessed that, but in case anyone went that far ahead and actually thought about it a little bit in their head, then you might have been correct if you got that answer. So today we'll be on the Chinese Civil War, which took place roughly between 1927 and 1949, and it's really had a big impact on how we see China today and how we have to kind of remember of not just China today, but another small little island debated nation off its coast by the name of Taiwan. And we will explain that, do excuse me, at the very end here. We will explain the big thing with that, and I know that when I started this channel, I kind of listed I wasn't going to get too political, but in this case, we're going to get political only with the Chinese, not with American politics. But we're going to get political with the Chinese government, but it won't matter because they're not going to see nothing because they are protected by the great government-run firewall that in China they do not have YouTube. YouTube is blocked in China. It's like a lot of things are blocked in China, but we'll get to that wonderful little nation. Ooh, I hate the Chinese. The communist Chinese. I love the Taiwanese, and any that came here to America, I love them. But I do not trust the communists. I just don't. It's the communists I don't like. But anyway, we'll get to that here at the end. I'll try to refrain myself. But I really don't have a whole lot to say about the People's Republic of China. I really don't. But we're going to go here and explain how this kind of came along and what happened. Now, basically, we will use the globe when we need to. In fact, we'll use it right now, even though I think we all know where China is. We'll show. And we will use this globe multiple times to point to certain locations in China. Right here is the wonderful country of China. Just wonderful. It's massive. And the most populous nation on this planet, I believe. Anyway, we will point to certain locations on this map as we go, when needed. Basically, to start explaining the Chinese Civil War, you have to go before the Civil War, and that's going to take us back to roughly the 19th century. And at this time, China was not a republic in any form. It wasn't even communist. It was an empire run by an absolute monarchy. And in fact, it was the Chinese Empire, or the Qing Empire, by the Qing dynasty that ruled China at this time, Qing emperors, which ironically, when you say Qing in Chinese, it's spelled Q-I-N-G. It's not S-E-H. Their Q makes a C sound. It's kind of weird. But anyway, back at this time, China was the last remaining empire from ancient days, really, that was still in existence. So for the ancient world, this was like the last major governmental form from that era. It was really astonishing and very important and kind of really interesting that it survived for so long. But eventually, in the 19th century, there was a lot of pressure by Western imperialist powers, such as Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and even the United States. And they really started to impress a lot of trade restrictions with China. They started kind of going to wars with them to try to break them down even further. And then on top of that, and again, we're going off the notebook here, not only this, but they even acquired these mandate cities in China that were essentially, although they were in China, they were essentially under the rule and government of a foreign colonial power, such as the cities of Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Tsingtao were all part of this little mandate system that had been formed. Due to this and the many defeats in the wars that were often fought, like here's a fun factor, opium, which is refined into the drug today, as we probably more commonly known, is very commonly refined into the drug heroin. Opium was a very big commodity back in the 19th century, and a lot of it would come from China, and Britain in particular, and France, were both heavy buyers of this opium. So remember, they're buying heroin. Well, eventually there came a trade disagreement between them and the Qing government in about 1830s, 1840s, and it got so bad that the Chinese stopped trading with the opium. They stopped exporting the opium to Britain and France, and in response, Britain and France literally went to war just because they wouldn't sell them the opium. I don't know if it was over political reasons or if it was just because of the fact that they were so addicted to the heroin that they needed more and they were willing to do anything they could to get it. But yeah, we literally would fight a war with China just because they won't give us more drugs. Honestly, I think China's in the right in this position. You don't need the drug. But anyway, the Qing was also called the Manchu dynasty, as its emperors were there. They had come to power in the 1600s after taking power from the Ming dynasty of China, and they had come from an area of northeastern China called Manchuria, which we're going to show here shortly because it's also going to relate to just before World War II, as Japan kind of had a handing in this region. So we will show what that area is, and I'll bring that up again when that happens. Now, due to the many war defeats that was happening in China, the trade regulations that were being harsh to the nation, the mandate cities that were being established, a lot of Chinese citizens started to see their country as being exploited by Western colonial powers, and they wanted a large amount of reform from the imperial government. Well, the Qing government did kind of conform and did kind of agree with the citizens, and the fact that they did really try to do a new policy of what they called a self-strengthening one. And in this policy, they basically would adopt European systems of military or organization and a European education system to try to modernize the country. Because China was it was way behind in industrialization compared to what the European colonial powers and the United States were at that time. And it was kind of like Japan, but then again, Japan had been opened up in 1853, and after that, it rapidly industrialized. Now, this didn't really work at all, although it was meant to. It just really didn't work out. And the dissatisfaction kept growing, and in 1900, there was what we called the Boxer Rebellion in China, which was against the presence of Western colonial imperialist powers by a group of rebels who were later endorsed by the emperor himself as to herself. It was she at the time. And they attacked a lot of the foreign embassies and mandate cities in China, but ultimately this rebellion failed, and even harsher restrictions were put in place on China from these powers in response, including the United States. The United States did take part in this. Now, the liberals in China, after this Boxer Rebellion in 1900, they subsequently began to realize we need to get rid of the imperial government because it's really the cause of this problem. If we get rid of that, then we can start working out the other problems. So they start working to overthrow the Qing dynasty, and this is led by a young leader in their organization by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, or Dr. Sun Yat-sen, as he was also a medical doctor, he had lived part of his life in the United States. He had actually lived in Hawaii for a short time. He had lived in other countries as well, and he was very influenced by Western philosophy and Western dictates of democracy. And he very much intended that once they overthrew the Qing dynasty, to place a republic in China, a democratic republic for the nation. That was what he aimed to do once this was done. Sun Yat-sen was a very decent guy. He developed even 3 principles of democracy that he kind of had, or 3 principles of the people, I suppose, is another thing that I think he called them. And these basically stated that the 3 principles were nationalism, democracy, and that a people's union or people's livelihood or along that line. Almost the same as the Declaration of Independence, what it spelled out here in the United States, but he kind of adapted the words. But anyway, revolution finally broke out in 1911, and this was mostly due to a bomb that went off in one of the cities. But this bomb was accidental, but out of fear that the Qing government was going to start ousting anyone that it viewed as dissident or against the government as possibly being responsible for the bombing, the liberals kind of decided we're going to start the revolution now because we don't know if we're going to be out of power or what's going to happen to us, so we need to probably go ahead and just start this thing early. And basically, it was before the repression could be dealt. So this breaks out in 1911. Now, in 1912, this time, unlike China the Qing government had had a series of rebellions across its little tenure of power in China, but most of these had always failed. This one actually would succeed, though, because of the fact that this time the army actually chose the side of the rebels. The army joined them, and mostly that was because they didn't approve of the Qing's government because it was keeping the army from really becoming a more modern army like the ones in Europe or Japan. And they really didn't like that at all, so they wanted to modernize, and they're like, well, we're going to join the rebels. We don't like you anymore. Now that the Qing rulers have lost the support of the army and of the people, in 1912, the last Qing emperor, Pu Yi, who, fun fact, he was only 3 years old at the time, so it was more of other people made the decision for him. He abdicated the Chinese imperial throne, ending the Qing dynasty and ending the Chinese empire that had been in place for over 2,000 years. So a 2,000-year-old empire that survived from the ancient days of the Romans was now done in 1912. Ironically, the same year that the Titanic sank, so it's a really momentous year. Anyway, as we go on here, a provisional republic is set up in China after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and this is set up by Sun Yat-sen. And it's much modeled on the U.S. system. There's your Senate, there's your House, basic representative democracy that is modeled on the American system that he wanted to set up. And he then even Sun puts himself as provisional leader of this republic. And he also appoints a former Qing army general, Yuan Shikai, to be kind of the co-ruler and official leader for the time of the provisional government that was being formed. So here we do have some images today. I know that we do. Let me find it here. Okay. I'll find the two we're going to see here real quick. I'm going to show you. Yeah, no. This is an image of who Dr. Sun Yat-sen was. He's kind of put as the founder of modern China. He had partly lived here in the United States. This is him. In fact, to this day, he's probably the only subject that both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China actually can agree on. He's the only person that they really have a mutual respect for, and they will commonly both talk good about. Other than that, they're just at each other's throats. But when it comes to Sun Yat-sen, they both kind of agree that he was a very great man and that he was the forerunner of the modern Chinese nation, regardless of which nation you're talking about. And the other photo we're going to have here, this is our wonderful little Qing army general who kind of takes the leading of this provisional government under Sun's direction, and that is Mr. General Yuan Shikai. This is him. It really looks like your stunning, typical imperial Chinese general. He really kind of does in my mind. He's got the beard and everything. Little thin beard. But anyway, there were general elections that were then held to try to elect a proper ruling party and a president. Unfortunately, although Sun Yat-sen had founded his own political party, which he called the Kuomintang, or more commonly as we will know it, and I will call it the Kuomintang, although his party gained the most popularity, it didn't gain the majority of the vote. And in response to this, Sun, I say Sun, but it could be Sun, one of the way. Anyway, he goes to Yuan Shikai and he asks him to kind of settle the debate and act as China's leader until this can be solved out. Act as the leader of the nation, rule it until we can solve out what we're doing here. Well, Yuan kind of takes this to his head, and this was kind of a very bad miscalculation. Basically, what Yuan does is he outlaws all political parties, including Sun's Kuomintang, and he basically asserts himself as a dictator because he declares himself the new emperor. He declares himself a new emperor, intending to start a new imperial line in China, and this leads to another civil war from 1915 to 1917, and basically trying to detest that Yuan, no, we just had an emperor, we don't want you. And basically, this continued until 1917 because Yuan didn't die until 1916. He was dead within a short time. After Shikai's death, China then falls apart. China had been united for over 2,000 years, mostly under the dynasties. There had been small periods where it wasn't. Even the Mongol invasion back in the 12 and 1100s. But the bad thing that happened was after Shikai's death, although Sun Yat-sen intended to establish this republic, he only really had a lot of support in the areas that had been controlled by the foreign nations along the east coast of China and a little bit in the south, where the rest of China broke up into these different separate regions that were controlled by these different warlords, which were basically former army generals that were claiming their own territories to rule. So it was just broken up into these little sectors that warlords controlled. Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang, subsequently, they kind of established an official Republic of China, is what they called it, in 1917, as during the middle of World War I. And they basically set out that they're going to reunify China at any cost under the Kuomintang rule, under the leadership of this ROC, or Republic of China, or ROC, for if you want to use an abbreviation. And it has no C. Okay. The Kuomintang, unfortunately, they failed to secure aid from any of the major Western imperial powers, including the United States, and this may be because they're kind of still, even though they're not the Qing government, they're very highly against the imperialist little mandate cities and everything else, which most of the foreign nations still have. I mean, Tsingtao was returned to them only because at the end of World War I, Germany during World War I, Japan had occupied it, had declared war on Germany during World War I. It had occupied Tsingtao, taken it from the Germans, and then at the end it was demanded to give Tsingtao back to China, and then it was called Qingdao. They renamed the city Qingdao, which is, I think it still is today. But that was about the only city. Like Shanghai, Shanghai, I think, was also given back, but like Hong Kong was a British mandate until the 1997, I believe. It was probably the longest of these mandate cities. So the Kuomintang, they failed to secure that aid from these major cities, so they turned to another possible source of that aid, and that's the new large nation to their north, that other wonderful nation of the 20th century I just love to talk about, and I just loved with all my heart. The wonderful Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. And they receive aid from them, because both are new governments, and the Soviet Union kind of views that it wouldn't be a bad thing to maybe build up Chinese relations. So they secure their funding from them to fund this military campaign to reunite China under their rule. In 1920, though, this is where things are going to start changing. In 1920, we get another political party kind of becomes evident in China. There's another group that's starting to form here, and this is not the one I love. This is the Chinese Communist Party. Is founded in 1921, I believe. 1920, 1921, around there. And they're created, although there is initial fighting between them and the Kuomintang, who are also known as Nationalists. because they have a high sense of Chinese nationalism. So if we call them nationalists, which we probably will a lot here later in the video, it's just the Kuomintang. That's just what we call them. So the nationalists is what we're going to start calling them here is when I can. But anyway, although there was initial fighting between the two sides, they kind of put it aside and worked together shortly because they both realized that before we can go at each other's throats, we probably need to take care of the warlords first. So they try to start taking care of the warlords. Well, this alliance only works out for so long. In 1925, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he dies. He didn't really ever get to rule China fully. He had a very short term, and he would have been, I think, in my opinion, he would not have been a bad leader for China at all, but he just never really got to rule it that much. He dies in 1925, and his successor is handpicked, and his name is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang, as we will show an image here, here is Chiang Kai-shek. This was his hand-picked successor. Him and Sun were very good friends, and Sun was like his mentor, basically, is what he was. This is Chiang. And we'll show that again if we need to be. So he takes over in 1925 upon the death of Sun Yat-sen. Unfortunately, 2 years later, Chiang kind of turns his back on the communists because he starts learning that they're trying to foment revolution in China in view to the communist system. And he is sick of this, and he just like, okay, I thought we had a truce here. And basically what he does, he starts attacking them with his Kuomintang troops. And instead of fighting the warlords, now he's fighting the warlords and he's going against the communists, starting the Civil War, which is now going to start here in 1927. So that is our prelude as to how this is going to start. Move the notebook here. So now we're going to get to the first stage of this war. Chang and his Kuomintang, they basically, what they do is they repeatedly attack and they repeatedly oppress any of the communists or any communist sympathizers that they can find in China. They do not like the communists. They do not want them in power. They want them out. They want them destroyed. They want them gone. Nada. The funny thing is the Soviet Union, who is giving aid to them, is also giving aid to the communists. They're giving aid to both sides because the Soviet Union, we typically imagine them as supporting the communists, but at this time, they honestly didn't really care which side won the war. They basically saw that whichever side wins the war is going to be favorable to us, so we don't really care who's going to win this war. We'll aid you both. And remember, Stalin is in power in the Soviet Union at that time, so that also explains the policy, because he was a very messed up man. Very messed up. I don't think Russia has YouTube either, but if they do, guess what? Stalin was a messed up man. Messed up. So are most communist dictators, which we'll get to another one here shortly. Under the basically what happens is by 1934, the Nationalists, or Kuomintang, we're going to start calling them Nationalists now, their armies now have the communists encircled. They're trapped in southern China. And basically what happens is the communists are under their leader, who is a name that we might have all heard before, and his name is Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong, depends on how you pronounce it, but I say Zedong. But anyway, Mao Zedong kind of leads the communists, and he leads them to sneak out of this encirclement, and they trek for over a year, for 368 days, I believe. They trek over 6,000 miles, which is longer than it is to New York to San Francisco. They trek 6,000 miles from southern China to the northern mountains in northern China just to escape and kind of regroup. And basically, it's very hard for them, and they set out initially with about 86,000 soldiers. Only 4,000 of them actually make it to the mountains by the time they do. They would march by night most of the time, because it was usually the time of day that but at nighttime was typically not a time that the Kuomintang armies would be moving, so you could very well move quickly and without opposition. So they would commonly move at night, and sometimes you could look off the distance and see the torches as they're going along. And these communists, basically, they come to know this as the Long March. In China, this is what it's still known as, is the Long March. And it's kind of a testimony in their eyes as to the resiliency of the Chinese Communist Party. Which, ugh, ugh. Basically what happens is they do reach the mountains of northern China, and they're able to kind of regroup. Well, after this, things kind of take a nosedive in another direction. Chang and his little nationalist regime, the Kuomintang's nationalist regime, they become increasingly unpopular in China due to a lot of issues that start occurring. Taxes, the nationalist regime starts putting taxes on the peasants. They start becoming a heavily corrupted system with all these corrupt politicians inside it. And it's really starting to downgrade their view in the eyes of the Chinese people. Another problem, and this is going to be the big one here, is an invasion problem. In 1931, Japan, from its colony of Korea, at the time, Korea was a Japanese colony, it invades the northeastern section of China known as Manchuria. We're going to show what Manchuria is right now, because keep in mind, this is where the Qing emperors had been from. And actually, we're going to have a funny little thing here in a second. Right here is China. This section right here, it even says it. This section right here, this big old section north of North Korea, which is another wonderful communist city, this is Manchuria. The Japanese, from their colony here, here's Japan, here's their colony, they move up and conquer all this, take it. They form it into a puppet state, which they call Manchukuo. And in a other act of kind of weirdness, the exiled emperor, Qing Emperor, Puyi, who had been 3 years old at the time that the Qing Empire had finally been dissolved, the Qing dynasty had abdicated. When he abdicated, he was only 3. He's much older now. He's a full-grown adult. He's actually installed as the puppet president of this new government. So it's kind of a further insult to these people. And what happens is China invades that in 1931. This is 3 years prior to the Long March, and Chiang and his government did hardly nothing to stop them. So, strike one there. Well, as we all know, Japan was not done with its imperialist ambitions in China. And basically, after this starts, they begin to invade multiple important Chinese cities and coastlines, and trying to take Chinese territory away from the Chinese. And this really starts in 1937, and they end up taking the Chinese capital city for the nationalist government of Nanking, or Nanjing, depends on how you pronounce it. And I think we might have all heard of either the Massacre of Nanking, or as I know it as, the Rape of Nanking, which, although Japan denies it, I hate to tell you, Japan, you are guilty of it. It's not okay to go around... Ugh. I'll let you people look that up on your own time. I'm not going to be listing what the Japanese did in Nanking in 1937 when they took that city. I will not list that. I will let you look that up on your own time if you wish, but I'm just going to tell you right now, some of it's a little graphic. It's not something you want to really think about or see the photos of. It even creeps me out. But basically what happens is Japan starts doing this aggressive campaign of invasion in China. And the communist guerrillas that have been fighting the nationalists, now they're also starting to fight the Japanese, which the nationalists are already trying to do. But unfortunately, compared to the nationalists, the communists are like a heck of a lot better at this. They're kicking the Japanese rear end. And why, I don't exactly always know, but it may be into the unconventional nature of the tactics. But this is also a strange insult, because the communists were relying mostly on their own supplies and stuff that they could receive from the Soviet Union, while the nationalist government is receiving supplies not only from the Soviet Union, but by this time they're also receiving supplies from the United States, because they're fighting Japan. And although the United States is not really involved in anything yet, it's still lending the supplies because it does view Japan as a threat, and kind of starts helping them. And they're getting all this help and not even doing it. Well, during this time period, the war with the Communists and the Nationalists is still raging on, and there's like a talk between both sides to maybe do an alliance between the two, or a truce, until the Japanese can be defeated, to work together to get them out. Of course, this is kind of rejected at first, and then in 1938, Chiang is captured by the Communists. He's captured by them in one of the major cities in northern China. Well, instead of killing him, they kind of come to the conclusion, we want to form an alliance with you, because we need to. If we're going to kick the Japanese out, we got to work together. And what probably would amount to the only time that this would happen, it was kind of shaky, even though it happened here. Through these negotiations, they eventually agreed to work together, with basically the main negotiating being done by Chiang Kai-shek himself and the communist leader that was not Mao Zedong, but by the name of Zhou Enlai. He kind of takes on the negotiations that are going to take place, and him and Chiang mostly work out the details of their agreement. And eventually this leads to an agreement that they are going to combine their forces or work in cooperation with each other to kick the Japanese out of China, to get them out. And the two sides basically remain in this very shaky, uneasy alliance and throughout World War II until the end of it in 1945. So that is basically, during World War II, they actually kind of worked together. Now things are going to get bad. Really bad. And before we move on, I suppose we ought to show our wonderful other very important figure. Although this photo was taken about 10 years after the Civil War ended, this is probably what most people see when they think of Mao. They see this photo, or this kind of man. This was Mao. This was the main communist leader. Today, he's in China. He's actually known as their main father. Founding father, basically, in China. Anyway, this brings us now to the second half of this war, and the communist triumph that's going to happen. Yes, the communists won, as I think you could probably have been able to tell by now. Basically what happens is Japan surrenders after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. And Japan finally surrenders. Both sides now are starting to look to renew their hostilities because their alliance has served its purpose. Now let's get back to killing each other. Why, I don't know. Well, the United States isn't too enthused with this, and there was many reasons, and they actually start sending advisors to really kind of help mediate the talks between the two sides to try to prevent another conflict from reigniting in itself, to try to get a peace agreement between the two. At the same time, the communists are becoming more and more liked by the common Chinese people, especially the peasants, because the communists are actually helping the peasants. They're giving food to them, they're helping them out, and they're being a lot kinder to the Chinese common people than the nationalists were, who are still imposing these heavy taxes on them, and now inflation's starting to rise in the country in the corruption of the Kuomintang government. So it's really starting to hamper the public relations aspect of which party has an advantage there. The Japanese troops in China, after the Japanese surrender, they were basically ordered in the surrender treaty that was signed on the Missouri on September 2nd of 1945, that they were to surrender to the Kuomintang forces. Even though the communist forces have been fighting alongside them in cooperation, they were given no instructions to surrender to the communists. They had to surrender to the nationalist forces, which was kind of an insult to the CPC, or the communist, basically the Communist Party in China. That's what we're going to call it. The Communist Party of China, or CPC. That's what we'll abbreviate this as. And they basically, and when it make matters worse, some of the commanders of the nationalists urge the Japanese troops to continue fighting the CPC into like mid-September, before they finally make them quit, just to crush and weaken the communists. This is wrong, but not too wrong. Not in the nationalist mind. I'm not saying the nationalists were perfect, but I think the communists are far worse. They're far worse. But I'm not saying the nationalists are innocent of everything. They had some problems. In an effort to try to retain their little power, what the warlords, who are still in China, they still hold certain areas, even though a large portion of it has been reunited under the Kuomintang rule. They had cooperated mostly with the Japanese during World War II, and now they switch sides, and now they start joining the Kuomintang because they fear that if the communists start taking over, they're going to lose their power, which rightfully so, they would. So basically, an alliance of convenience for them. Chang makes many of these warlords generals in his army and gives them specific orders to continue to weaken the CPC and its forces, which now even more greatly sours the public relations field because now a lot of Chinese citizens are starting to see that the nationalist regime is working with convicted Japanese collaborators from the war. Real great public image. So they really don't like this image either of the nationalist government, and only causes more of them to flee to the CPC or communist side. The United States, as we mentioned, is trying to negotiate talks between the two. It wants an end of hostilities. It supports the nationalist regime because at this point the Cold War is starting to begin, and the U.S. government is very fearful of the spread of communism. And of course, the Soviet Union, on the other hand, is rooting for the communists to win by this point. And in this effort to try to diffuse and prevent any hostilities that are going to come, the U.S. President Harry Truman, he sends Secretary of State George Marshall. He sends him to China with several ambassadors to try to negotiate a peace settlement between the two sides in the wartime capital of. Because although the Japanese had retreated by this point and they had received Nanking back, the Chinese government of the nationalists had not quite moved back there yet, and they hold talks in what had been their wartime capital of Chongqing. On October 10th of 1945, basically, the two sides do reach an agreement, and they're going to work for a united and a democratic China. Excuse me again. And this basically is going to be accomplished. They're going to create commissions that are going to work out the details here of how to do this in the proper way. This is satisfying to the U.S. at the time. They think that things are going to go well. Well, the commissions never meet. And the fighting breaks out again prior to the new talks in December of 1945. And on January 10th of 1946, Marshall kind of comes back. He's like, okay, you two need to get it together now. We don't want this. And on January 10th of 1946, there basically becomes an armistice that is signed between the nationalists and the communists, and they basically agree that they're going to convene a national assembly in May, and that they're going to create a constitution and all these other government issues that they're going to take and do. Well, again, these are kind of false promises, or they're not going to work out. One of the two. Well, as the Soviet and American troops kind of finally withdraw from China because they're finally getting out where they had occupied Japanese-held areas from World War II and give it back to China, both the KMT and the CPC start rapidly moving to occupy these new territories that have been vacated, to move their forces there. And they basically resume the fighting regardless of this agreement, and they resume the fighting in July, regardless of the agreement. They ignore it completely. Of course, the U.S. is finally done at this point. As Marshall actually leaves China to go back home, he denounces the extremists on both sides, both the nationalists and the communists, for not seeing the right and just bringing this to a close. Well, the nationalists, now that the war has begun again, the ceasefire is over, they make a lot of major gains at first into 1946. In 1947, they make a lot of major gains, and they even take the major communist base of Kalgan in 1946, in October. The KMT, or the Kuomintang, they offer new talks, but the communists don't really want to come to the table. They don't want to take part in that because you just took Kalgan, you killed I don't know how many communists, and also the fact that the Kuomintang demanded that in order to start the talks, the communists had to give up their military gains. How is that fair? So they do not agree to the talks that are proposed. Now, the KMT, or the Kuomintang, they adopt a new constitution without the presence of the communists. They adopt a new constitution in December of 1946 without the presence of the communists. So they're doing it on their own authority, kind of like a dictator. And starting in the next year, in 1947, the communists start turning the tide. It does not go well for the nationalists. This basically the communist forces, they occupy and block throughout 1947. They managed to occupy or block most every nationalist supply route into northern China, where the communists are based, and into Manchuria, which has been regained after the fall and surrender of Japan. And this leads to the withdrawal of the Kuomintang forces from northern China in 1948. They're entirely out of northern China. Northern China is under communist control now, basically, because they pushed the Kuomintang out by cutting their supply lines. And the increased little hostility to the Kuomintang ain't helping their numbers either. And to kind of push here, what we're showing, this is basically what we're going to show. They're pushing, right here is Nanjing. Today is Nanjing, back then it was Nanking. This was the nationalist capital, was right here. Right in here, right here. They basically are now, all the northern China up here and Manchuria is under communist control. What's happening. And this does not go very well, of course. By December, all of northern Chinese seaports are also occupied, with one exception, and that's that city of Qingdao, which was the former Tsingtao, and they're all communist occupied except for that port, which eventually that falls as well. The U.S. already has stopped acting as the mediator. By now, they're also starting to cut their aid that they've been supplying to the Kuomintang, because of the factor that when the Kuomintang would lose at a battlefield, they're leaving all the equipment behind that's fully operational, and the communists are now gaining this equipment. They're gaining Sherman tanks, they're gaining artillery, arms, ammunition, everything, because they're just dropping it to the ground and let them take it. Real smart. You're arming your own enemy. Real smart. So the U.S. finally starts cutting aid to the Kuomintang entirely. And this kind of offsets the Kuomintang, because they thought the U.S. was going to support them with that no matter what happened. And now it's kind of becoming evident, oh, maybe we got a problem. Well, by 1949, the Nationalists are basically so hard-pressed that they only have one last major defense line to hold the communists from breaking from northern China, into central China and sweeping the entire remaining nationalist territory. By this time, the nationalists are quite weakened in their numbers, and the Chinese communists, they've already grown. Mao Zedong has grown his communist guerrilla armies into like a unified people's army, as he calls it. And basically, the communists in just months had gone, they only controlled maybe 1/10 of the nation. Now they control 1/3 of this nation. And basically, they've captured the huge amounts of arms, the ammunition, the guns, the tanks, the artillery, everything, just from the Kuomintang. And they're U.S. made, so they're good weapons. Well, the nationalist government, of course, is also coming hit hard because their prices are inflation. They have very bad inflation. It is skyrocketing, and the living costs, as a consequence, are also skyrocketing. So economically, the nationalist regime is also hard pressed. Mao does offer possible negotiation terms for the Kuomintang, but with the inclusion that the Kuomintang the certain terms that he included, the Kuomintang could not accept, because they were very much against their interests and they were not going to accept them. Well, this kind of proves the last straw, and it kind of proves to be their downfall. We've reached 1949 here. This is the critical year. And Chang resigns his post, finally, as president of the Republic of China on January 21st of 1949, and his successor, Li Songjin, he basically accepts these terms of Mao's as a basis for talks, because he's determined to keep the communists in the north. He doesn't want them sweeping the entire nation. So they meet but he also, in the meantime, he abandons the city of Peking, which today we more commonly know as Beijing. He abandons this to the communists. This is exactly what Mao wanted. He wanted that city abandoned. He wanted to declare it as a capital to use because it was a more major city. And immediately after this, the Nationalists moved their capital from Nanking. They moved it to the city of Canton, and they try to rally the remnants of their forces behind these supposed talks that are going to occur. But Mao eventually issues 21 terms, more than what he initially said. And he demands the end of the current national government, and that the KMT has 3 days to respond to this ultimatum, basically. Well, of course, we can probably guess that the nationalist government, does not agree to these terms. They reject them. And the communists then, as Mao had already planned, now launches a major offensive that breaks through the northern line that had been developed around the cities of Nanking, Shanghai, and the what river was it here? Let me look at my globe. There's a river that they used too, but it really didn't prove much. Let me yeah, the Yellow River, or the Wangha. I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, but the other name for it would be the Yellow River. But basically, now their communists are launching their final major offensive, and it's just crushing the nationalist forces as they sweep southward through China. They're basically going in one direction. The Chinese have basically gone. The communists are now moving from the north, and they're just sweeping south, taking everything that is coming in their way. Every city, everything. And the nationalists are losing ground like nothing. Basically, by the rest of the major cities then soon fall as this offensive comes, including the cities here I got listed of Shanghai, Wuhan, which I think we all know about right now because that's where this whole coronavirus started. So another wonderful thing, China, you get to give us viruses. And Qingdao, that last seaport, and Lanchao all fall. And on October 1st, by October 1st, most of China is now under their control, except for a small portion of the southern China. And basically what Mao does, again, here's our wonderful friend Mao. Mao declares on October 1st of 1949 the new People's Republic of China with its capital based at the city of Peking, which is then changed to its other name of Beijing. That starts that. Then we get to, as the month kind of goes on October 10th, the nationalist government moves its capital once again, and it moves it back to the wartime capital during World War II of Chongqing. In the fall of 1949, after declaring that their People's Republic had been formed, the PRC, as we will know them as now, they take Chongqing, and they take Canton, and they take Guiyang. The nationalist government then flees again, and its remaining forces withdraw from the mainland entirely to 2 islands on China's coast. They move to the islands of Taiwan, and they flee to the island of Hainan, and Hainan later falls in 1950, leading eventually by 1950 the only island in the nationalist regime's control is Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek retakes his former role as president of the Republic of China, or ROC, and in late 1949, and in December, and he establishes his capital on Taiwan at the Taiwan city of Taipei. And he declares this is temporary. He will retake the mainland, which is where we're going to discuss here in a very short second. And that basically ends the Civil War hostilities, except for a year later when Hainan would be captured. And just so we know, I don't think you might know where Taiwan is. I don't think you probably know where Hainan is. This is the island of Taiwan. This little island right here. Just miles, there's a little strait between that and the mainland. And this is Hainan, which was later taken from the nationalists. These 2 islands were what they moved to, and they lost this one. So today, all they have left is this. Now, the war had been very costly to both sides in this war. Here's the estimates that I've been able to find. About 1.5 million communists were killed in this war. 7 million nationalists died, and about 5 million civilians due to starvation, due to outright war and everything else. Now, the odd thing is, Chang, even though he basically only has control of Taiwan, he claimed the rest of his life, he died in 1975, that they were still the legitimate rulers of all of China and claimed that the People's Republic of China did not exist. And Mao Zedong, of course, did just the opposite. He claimed that he was the legitimate ruler of all of China, which he probably had more fact to back up his claim than Chiang did. Well, the odd thing was, the United Nations had been formed in 1945. At that time, the nationalist regime was still in power. And China, of course, was one of the 5 permanent member council nations, and it still is today. Well, even after the nationalists had been basically fled to Taiwan and they'd been placed there, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the United Nations, basically with pressure from the Western powers, continued to recognize the Republic of China, or the nationalist regime, as the legitimate representative for China, even though they only ruled one island. And they refused to recognize the People's Republic, which was supported every year, both resolutions from the Soviet Union and from other communist allies who recognized it almost immediately. It wasn't until 1971 that this was finally changed, that the Taiwan was finally out and the People's Republic of China was finally recognized in the United Nations as the representative for China. Another problem that comes here is the fact that after the loss of Hainan, the People's Liberation Army, as Chinese Communist Army was then known, they prepared to launch their invasion of Taiwan. They want to finally wipe out the nationalists once and for all. Well, this becomes a very big deterrent because by 1950, the United States is fully involved in the war against communism, and they're getting involved in Korea that year because North Korea has invaded the South. And very unfortunately for the People's Republic of China, which, in my opinion, was kind of a in-your-face gesture, which I like, the United States sends warships around Taiwan, and they basically put in place an ultimatum to China saying, if you invade this island, you will have to go through us. Which to this day is still our position, that if Taiwan is ever forcibly invaded to reunite it with the mainland, we will militarily defend them. And I think it's been the only reason the People's Republic of China has never invaded Taiwan, is because they fear going to war, knowing that if they go to war with Taiwan, they go to war with the United States. Even though we don't officially recognize them, because People's Republic of China, they have a very bad policy, in my opinion, and it's recognized by the United States, which I think is also very wrong. And that's the One China policy, and basically the People's Republic of China, or China as we know it today, as the nationalist regime, it's officially known as the Republic of China, although they've kind of adopted the name of their island that they fled to, and they are now commonly known as just Taiwan. Well, anyway, the People's Republic of China refuses to do trade or any kind of relations with any nation that recognizes Taiwan as a separate country. It wasn't until the 1970s that we started recognizing the Communist China, only because of the fact they were going at odds with the Soviet Union, and it kind of provided an alliance to kind of go against them, a counter-Soviet alliance. And that was the only reason we really did it. Until then, we had continued to support the nationalist regime that was exiled in Taiwan. Well, due to this, only to this day, I think only 5 nations or so still recognize Taiwan as the official legitimate government of China, and most of them have switched to the PRC. Well, I do not agree with this policy. I think it's a lot of garbage. And contrary to China's claims, I think that by now, Taiwan probably needs to either be recognized as a separate nation, or you need to come about to a peaceful way of doing this, of getting back together and reunifying. I do not trust the Chinese communists and the People's Republic of China. I'm not saying the nationalists were innocent of everything, because they had some bad parts, but this is also based on current things. They have a human rights record unlike anything. I kid you not. Mao Zedong, later in his life, he turned out to be one of the most brutal dictators there ever was on this planet. His cultural revolution and great leap forward cost I don't know how many lives in China, just to try to conform to it. And he literally was so authoritarian it wasn't funny. There was a little red book, Mao's little red book, and this is still in China today, of all famous sayings and teachings from Mao himself. And everyone in China, every kid, every adult, had to have a copy of that book. And I mean they had to. It was required. If you didn't, you were put in jail. You were executed. Mao did not die until 1976, a year after Chiang had died. And basically, it was just, ugh. It's just been havoc ever since. And even today, China is assuming things that it really has no basis for. It claims the entire South China Sea as its own, which it's not. I'm sorry, but I'm going to show you this one. China claims, I don't know if any of you know this, China claims that this whole area of sea, all the way down to here, is theirs. And they're building military reefs in here. Only small slims of this water that borders almost directly with these nations, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, is their territory. And of course, Taiwan gets no territory. It's a Chinese renegade province. That's what they view it as. Even in the Olympics, just to not upset the People's Republic and to allow Taiwan to participate, Taiwan has to participate under the name of Chinese Taipei, because the Republic of China is such a bully. I'm not a fan of the Chinese communists, and I very much think they will end up on an ash heap. They will not survive the next 100 years. They will die off, and China will have another form of government. The communists think they're so smart, but honestly, they're one of the most brutal human rights abusers in this nation, not in this nation, but in this world. And it's ridiculous that we free democratic nations let them get away with that kind of treatment. Just because of trading rights. I'm sorry, but I would view human rights over trade. We exploit that just so we can get a couple extra things from there? It's just ridiculous in my eyes that we even do that. For example, if China claims all that, then that's like the United States over here. That's like us claiming all the Caribbean Sea, except for the small, very small, maybe 2-mile portion that borders Mexico or Cuba or something like that. Nope, this is all ours. That's not how the world works. I do not trust the Chinese communists. I very much dislike them, and I do support the Republic of China. The Taiwan, I do support them as an independent nation. I think they need to be afforded proper respect and proper, basically, the proper, what would be the word here, recognition. It's just kind of ridiculous. And today, our last little thing, despite our longest video I think we've ever done, right here's the flag of China we all know. This is the flag of the People's Republic of China, or China. This has been their flag since 1949. The communists usually like to put stars in their flags with red and gold. Here's the flag of Taiwan, which was the flag of the nationalist regime in China from 1912 to 1949, and now it's been the flag of Taiwan since 1949. And this was their flag, and it still is. Although the Kuomintang are no longer actually in power in Taiwan, but they're the second largest party in Taiwan. So basically, ugh. And again, China will never get to hear any of this. I can criticize them all I want here because of the fact of one problem. They will never hear any of this because of the great firewall that they have. Tell me how you can claim to be a people's republic for the people when you have such observance of your citizens that you won't even let them see anything that the government disapproves of. Anything that goes against the government, people in China don't get to see. They have cameras in street lamps and the police officers that go just to identify where certain citizens are, and they track you. I'm not so sure our government doesn't already, but we have evidence of the Chinese doing it. The People's Republic of China. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, that is for a whole other thing. So that is basically the little basics here on the Chinese Civil War. That's all we had for this video. Again, next week we will be doing one on Chernobyl and one on the Battle of Berlin. I'm open to a third one if anyone suggests it, so feel free to put it in the comments or anything like that, or the discussion page on the main channel. Feel free to mention that if you have any ideas on that. But basically, just remember, the current situation with China, I think it needs to be a little bit ranged around. I think we need to recognize both And if China don't like that, well, guess what? We're going to have a little bit of a conflict here. Maybe not a war, but we might have a little bit of a disagreement. But we got to have the guts to actually go at these monsters and say, you need to be stopped because what you're doing is not right in human eyes. But anyway, that's the gist on that. So be sure to like, subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Anything of that nature, if you wish to. That is entirely up to you. I will try to post some links to any video that may help with this, but I will see what I can find. So basically, have a good rest of your week, and hope we all stay well.